I'll quickly begin the session. The first session is on how to write abstracts, and I have titled it Researching to Concretizing Abstracts and what really makes for a good abstract. I think most of us here are aware of what an abstract is. Even if you're not, I'll tell you shortly, I'll give a brief introduction to it as well. But before I begin the session, I really want to put forth this meme, which I don't know, but many of you might relate here, be it like whether you are an undergraduate student or a PhD student. So this is from PhD Comics, and yeah, you can just take a minute to read it. I won't read it out because the humor might just get lost, but it's more about writing and what Sonali just mentioned about writing accountability and what how writing happens. One thing that strikes out to me particularly about this cartoon is, am I typing a lot of words? No. Am I thinking a lot about what to write? Yes. And just to also give you a brief overview of what this session entails, I will talk briefly about what is research writing and what is research, what is an abstract, what are the components of an abstract, and tips on how to write an abstract. So, introduction to research writing. The first thing that comes to my mind when I talk about research or research writing is this quotation from Zora Neale Hurston, where Hurston writes that research is formalized curiosity. And curiosity is the most important component that we have to keep in mind when we do our research or any form of writing. Just that when we do academic writing, it becomes formalized. So, research is any form of formalized curiosity. Some characteristics of research as a form of inquiry. Um, it should be structured, it should be purposive, it should be directed, not simply an aggregate of information. It should be methodical. What this means is that whatever you write in your research paper, in your thesis, or even in your abstract should be structured, should follow a structure, should be purposive, that is, should have a purpose why you are doing it. It should be directed. It shouldn't be that it is going in all the directions. It should have one direction, and you should know what you are doing in your research. That's not the first time that you're going to explore. You should already know what you want to explore and the direction to take. Do understand that research is not an aggregate of information. What this means is that you need to also insert your own perspective, your own thinking, or your own idea into what already exists. So it can't be that, okay, four people have said this, and this is what my research is. Sure, four people have said this, but what does that mean? Or how is this relevant today? What do you mean by it? And what have you understood from it? And how can you contribute to this existing conversation? That is what it means to research and be a good researcher. And the other important point is that you have to be methodical, which means that your research should definitely have, it should have a method, but most importantly, it should be the first 3 points: structured, purposive, and directed. That is what the methodical part intakes, the method plus being structured, purposive, and directed. Now, some characteristics of research data in the humanities and social sciences. It is an acknowledgement of diverse perspectives, an appreciation for subjectivity, thick descriptions. This is something that has been given to us by Clifford Geertz. An emphasis on context, a focus on the processual and the relational, and a situated, critical, and reflexive approach to one's research questions. To explain these characteristics, your research data or your research should be an acknowledgement of diverse perspectives. It should not be that you only consider scholars who kind of conform to your views. If there are differing views, how then do you put them in dialogue with the views that conform to yours? That is also what makes for a good characteristic of research. The other thing is an appreciation for subjectivity, your own perspective, your own intervention. That is what it means to be subjective. Thick descriptions, again, it should just not be stated for the sake of it. It should be descriptive. There should be an emphasis on context. What is the context? Why this research now? Why its relevance now? There should also be a focus on the process as well as the relational. The relational bit here is useful to understand in terms of your own positionality. This particularly plays out if you are an anthropologist or a sociologist. A situated, critical, and reflexive approach to one's research questions. Again, a summing up of all the important characteristics that have just been mentioned above. You need to have a situated, a critical, and a reflexive approach, meaning that at all points, whatever point you consider to intervene with in your research should come from a place of critical inquiry, should come from a place of an understanding of your own position. So, these are some important characteristics that you should consider when you start your research. How is that research also relevant to you, or why does it speak to you? Perhaps that is the most important starting point for any research as well. And that takes us back to what Hurston says, that research is formalized curiosity. What made you curious about it in the first place is how you actually get into the depth of research and research writing. Now, what do we want to find out through research? Again, a number of things, and that would totally depend on what you want your output to be. It could be stories, interpretations, or narratives. It could be structures, levels, or networks. It could be individual voices, behaviors, actions, or events. It could also be the non human world or the sensory world. And most importantly, it could also be about relationality and connections and situations. So these are things that come to us when we start researching. And these are also things through which we research as well. Now, coming to the important bit for which most of us are here, which is abstract writing. And again, I would like to show you a very small comic strip. I think I'll read it out to you. This is a conversation between a student and their potential or perhaps their supervisor, where the supervisor says that they want the student to submit an abstract to a conference that is happening in 7 months. Now the student says, but I have no idea what kind of results it will have in 7 months. Basically, the research. They don't know what kind of idea or the results it will entail in the next 7 months. And the professor says, don't worry, the trick is to make it as vague and as open to interpretation as possible. The more ambiguous, the better. Do keep in mind that this point is coming from the professor. And again, we'll focus on the third panel. The trick is to make it as vague and as open to interpretation as possible. The more ambiguous, the better. And maybe we'll just like take a moment's time to just think and reflect if this is what we mean by abstract. This is just a small exercise. I don't need answers at the moment, but maybe afterwards when we are done with the lecture, maybe your own interaction with an abstract for the first time, or what do you mean by abstract? These are questions that I would like to seek an answer for from you, with particular emphasis on this third panel. Have you come across an abstract that is ambiguous, or where you have felt that the more ambiguous and abstract, the better it has been? And if you agree to the view that an abstract has to be vague and as open to interpretation as possible, we'll just take like half a minute to just like think. Just go back to any abstract or perhaps an abstract that you are writing. And are you like thinking on these lines or not that the professor is suggesting? Just think about it. Okay. And now the student is very perplexed, as you can see from the expression. And he asks, is that why it's called an abstract? And the professor says it's an abstract art form. So that's the joke here. But we have to think about if this is really an abstract art form. I would agree to a certain extent that writing abstracts is an art form. But is it the abstract art form? So, abstract is a short summary of your published or unpublished research paper, which is usually about a paragraph, say some 6 to 7 sentences, 150 to 250 words long. And again, in my experience, 250 words has always been the sweet spot. Anything less than 250 or anything more than 250 kind of either over conveys or under conveys what a paper or what that research article is about. A well written abstract serves multiple purposes. An abstract lets readers get the gist or essence of your paper or article quickly in order to decide whether to read the full paper. An abstract prepares readers to follow the detailed information, analysis, and arguments in your full paper. And an abstract helps readers remember key points from your paper. Now, again, I would ask you to go back to a time where you decided to go ahead and read a paper just based on an abstract. This has been the case in, like, personally, I have had a lot many times read abstracts and decided to go ahead and read the paper, knowing that even if that paper doesn't really speak to my research, the abstract has been written in such an interesting way that I'm curious to know more about what the paper is. And this is also one of reading techniques that we suggest to researchers and students, that if you want to know what the paper is about and you don't want to, like, I wouldn't say waste time, but if you are running short on time and you really want to figure out if that paper suits your research or not, an abstract always comes to your rescue. So instead of going through that entire paper, if you just look at the abstract, you would know whether that paper is appropriate to your research or not. And that is why it is very important to write good abstracts, because you wouldn't want to miss a chance to be read also by scholars in your field. And that is why an abstract also should convey all these important information, which is basically the essence of your paper or article. What is the paper about? Then the detailed information, analysis, and arguments in your full paper. Why have you written it and how have you written it? And later, an abstract helps readers remember key points from your paper. So it is important that you do pinpoint the key takeaways from your paper in your abstract. Basically, what has your paper done? So you begin with the question, what is this paper about? And by the time you have completed the abstract, it should tell the reader what has been done. So even if you like keep these two guiding questions in mind, you would be able to write a clean abstract. And again, remember, give yourself only 300 words in which you have to write an abstract. Anything more than 300, like we'll edit the 300 to 250 also, but anything beyond 300 won't work, won't count as a good abstract length. And this is very true when most of you or some of you apply to conferences. So if you're writing, I mean, abstract writing is also very good when you start thinking about what you have to also present at a conference. So if you're reading a call for papers, you would know that ideally they only ask for abstracts which are 150 to 250 words long, and you know it now. Why so? Now, what are the essential parts of an abstract? The important bit is that you don't have to introduce your article, you have to summarize your article. This is the most important key point. What happens is that sometimes we end up just introducing our article and not summarizing it. An abstract basically is a good summing up of what our research paper is about. And again, if I were to go back to the previous slide where I told you about the purposes, you would know why it is not an introduction, but a good summary of your research paper, right? Because it will give you the detailed information, it will tell me the essence of my entire paper, and will also give me the key points of my entire paper. So remember this, you're not introducing your paper, you are summarizing your paper in an abstract. You have to think of it in terms of telling a story. How? You state the puzzle or problem that the article is addressing rather than giving a barrage of data without an argument or a conclusion. So remember when we think of a story, which should have an introduction, then there is the entire plot, and then you have the conclusion. Your abstract also follows that format. You have to state the problem. What is this article doing? Instead of just saying that, okay, I use this information, I use this information, I use this information. Why did you use that information? State the puzzle, state the problem, give me the story. State the argument and a claim for the significance of that argument. Again, why this paper now? Or why this puzzle or problem now? Why is it relevant? Why should I pay attention to it? Okay, so the relevance or the significance, and reveal the most valuable finding. People are more likely to read an article if they know what's most interesting about it upfront. So you don't have to give me the entire methodology, but if you just state that this paper proves or that this paper reads whatever, and I'll show you the examples that I'm talking about. State your finding because that is also how I would be convinced to read your paper for more information or how you came to that finding. And this speaks to my research as well, right? So reveal the most valuable finding. State your methods briefly in no more than a sentence. Extremely important. Some abstracts end up with a lot of information about methodology that is not at all required. Just one sentence, and that should do. Don't let your description of how you conducted the study or developed your theoretical frame take over the abstract. This is an extremely important information, and this is something that you should keep in mind. Do not over describe your method at all. Use strong verbs and not vague ones. So instead of exploring or examining a subject, your abstract argues or demonstrates. Because if you don't use argues or demonstrates, I would still not be convinced to read your abstract. I would still think, okay, the researcher doesn't sound sure of themselves. Why? And again, an important information instead of attempts to or tries to, tell me that your abstract shows. You've already done the research. So there's no attempting to or there's no trying to. It has happened, it shows. So your abstract shows. The more convincing, the more strong verbs you use, the more convinced, the more curious I would be about your abstract. So remember, Even if you're doubting yourself as a scholar, don't let that reflect in your abstract. Be confident. You have done your research. You have come up with your findings. Show it. That is why your abstract must show. Include all the most relevant keywords since many search engines search by abstract and title alone. Very important again, Google Scholar, for example, would if your research, if you have to upload your article or if it is published, it will automatically take itself in the Google database, Google Scholar database, just by focusing on the keywords. So do not miss out on keywords, especially the relevant keywords. So if you're talking about artificial intelligence, you may also want to include a relevant keyword like post humanities also, or digital humanities or something like that, right? So that your paper also speaks to a host of other interdisciplinary disciplinary fields or other interlinked fields. Now, a small example to show you. This is a complete abstract. And I have indicated what has been highlighted through this abstract. Basically, all the points that we have mentioned till now. So, the title: Randomness, Uncertainty, and Economic Behavior: The Life of Money in 18th Century Fiction. So, without looking at the implications or research problem question on which appear on the right hand side of your screen, just read the abstract first. Take 2 minutes, just read it. Do not pay attention to what is the method or what is the argument or implication or method. That will come later. That is when I will tell you that, okay, this is what the abstract has done brilliantly well. Just read the abstract for your own sake without paying attention to the breakdown. And this is a complete abstract. Okay. Um, I'll take 1 more minute, and after a minute, I'll just like start explaining what's happening in this abstract and why this is actually a very good abstract. I'll just read it out. I'll read out the abstract now for everyone. The abstract reads as: My dissertation argues that fiction produced in England during the frequent financial crises and political volatility experienced between 1770 and 1820 both reflected and shaped the cultural anxiety occasioned by a seemingly random and increasingly uncertain world. The project begins with the historical framework of the multiple financial crises that occurred in the late 18th century. Seven crises took place between 1760 and 1797 alone, appearing seemingly out of nowhere and creating a climate of financial meltdown. But how did the awareness of economic turbulence filter into the creative consciousness? Through an interdisciplinary focus on cultural studies and behavioral economics, the dissertation posits that in spite of their conventional status quo affirming endings, opportunists are punished, lovers are married, novels and plays written between 1770 and 1820 contemplated models of behavior that were newly opportunistic, echoing the reluctant realization that irrationality had become the norm rather than a rare aberration. By analyzing concrete narrative strategies used by writers such as Frances Burney, Georgina Cavendish, Hannah Cowley, and Thomas Holcroft, I demonstrate that late 18th century fiction both articulates and elides the awareness of randomness and uncertainty in its depiction of plot, character, and narrative. This is what the abstract says. It is slightly complex in the sense this is talking about 18th century fiction. It is also taking into consideration cultural studies and behavioral economics. How do you break down this abstract? You know by the look of it that the project is immense, but they have summed up their dissertation in approximately 250 words and have also conveyed to me what their dissertation is about. So they've given me a broader, but also the particulars of the project and how. So if you just look at the first few lines, my dissertation argues that fiction produced in England during the frequent financial crisis and political volatility experienced between 1770 and 1820 both reflected and shaped the cultural anxiety occasioned by a seemingly random and increasingly uncertain world. This is the argument. And student, right? Right? The third word of the first line indicates that this is the argument, right? And it also mentions the implication. Why? Political volatility experienced between 1770 and 1820 both reflected and shaped the cultural anxiety occasioned by a seemingly random and increasingly uncertain world. So your argument has been established right at the beginning. Now I know what this paper or what this dissertation is about, what it is arguing. Now, the research problem. This project begins with the historical framework, and if you come down to this line, but how did the awareness of economic turbulence filter into the creative consciousness? This is the main puzzle. This is the main question of this dissertation. We know that there is some connection between 1770 and 1820. There's also some connection between the broader political economic scenario, but how is this affecting the individual? That is what this research problem is, or what the research question is. Okay? How has it filtered into the creative consciousness? Now, what is the method? How have they done their research? Through an interdisciplinary focus on cultural studies and behavioral economics, the dissertation posits that in spite of the conventional status quo, whatever, and novels and plays written between contemplated models of behavior that were newly opportunistic. Again, so this is one method, and if you come down to another point where I've written method, they have mentioned the names of the writers. And by analyzing concrete narrative strategies used by writers. Remember, going back to the previous point that I suggested, that your method should not overtake the abstract. It should just be limited to hi, I just dropped off, I think.
Yes, Sonakshi. Somehow he we stopped hearing you, and then you got. I mean, we can't see your screen. Could you please share the screen again and
Yeah.
start
Um,
from
uh,
that point?
could you tell me what was the last thing that you heard?
You were talking about how the method does not overpower the abstract.
Okay, okay. So you didn't. Okay. So sorry about this. I don't know how this happened and why this happened. Just 1 minute. Let me. Um, I think this is visible. Okay. So the method should not overpower the abstract, and you have it here in just one line by analyzing concrete narrative strategies used by writers. And again, you have the argument and implication towards the end. I demonstrate that late 18th century fiction both articulates and elides the awareness of randomness and uncertainty in its depiction of plot, character, and narrative. So, this is one example of the abstract that I have to share with you. And this is mostly an abstract for an entire dissertation, right? How would an abstract look like if you were to, say, write an abstract for a small research paper, like a smaller component of your dissertation, a chapter, or just like a research paper? So, if I could just go back. Yes, here. Uh, if you just look at this, again, we can take just 1 minute or 2 minutes to quickly read through this. And again, without paying attention to the text written in yellow, maybe you should try out and see what, if you could identify parts within this abstract. And then, just as a way of like self-assessment, just check if you have managed to like get it right. And it's also okay if not, but just like take 2 minutes quickly to go through this, and I'll just like begin then. An important thing is that also abstract, if you actually go, like, if we were to do a comparison of the two, it's not always mandatory for you to begin an abstract with an argument, right? You can take a different approach as long as you are able to tell what your abstract is, okay? So don't feel pressurized into conforming to a particular template, right? So this is that is why I have this example for you to also do a quick comparison. Just if you remember the previous abstract, you would know what I'm talking about. So it doesn't necessarily have to follow the same format. So there's no fixed template per se, right? Okay. So, if I were to read out this abstract aloud quickly, this article explores and historicizes the rise of the woman filmmaker in India in the late 1970s and the 1980s in two overlapping domains: a vastly expanding communications infrastructure, including the spread of television and second wave feminism. It takes as a case study the media maker Sai Paranjape, whose eclectic career across a range of media, theatre, TV, cinema, print, in multiple formats, ad films, documentaries, educational shorts, TV films, full length features, was fairly typical of the nature of women's media work at this time, as women took whatever work they could find in a rapidly mutating media ecology. The article suggests that these media migrations provide a model of gendered media work that is constitutively intermediate and thus reorders the aesthetic and narrative protocols of mainstream cinema. So here, if you just quickly have a look at this like abstract, you will know that the context has been set out right at the beginning. What is the context? That this article will explore and historicize the rise of the woman filmmaker in India, and the context is the late 1970s and 80s in two overlapping domains. It also tells you what um sorry. It also tells you what the method is, which is basically a case study the media maker of the case study of media maker Sai Ranjake. And then further down, you get to know what is the value of this article. Why? You have the context set 1970s and 1980s, and that was the time when the spread of television and second wave feminism was spreading forth in India. And this was, I mean, because this was the vast spread of communication, this was fairly typical of the nature of women's media work at this time. All of it, media theater, TV, cinema, as women took whatever work they could find in a rapidly mutating media ecology. So, this is the value that has been expressed through this article. And this abstract ends with the main argument, which is the article suggests that these media migrations provide a model of gendered media work that is constitutively intermediate and thus reorders the aesthetic and narrative protocols of mainstream cinema. And again, you would know that gendered media work is not something that has come in right at the end. It has already been indicated right at the beginning. The context has been set, the second wave feminism. And now that connection is made explicit towards the end. Okay. So now, if I were to do a quick before and after of the abstracts, also, you would see that as opposed to this abstract, you have the argument first, right? And here you have the context. Then you have the research problem and the question, then the method, then the argument or implications, then the method again, and then ending with argument or implications, right? Here you just have the context, you then have the method, then you have the argument or value of this paper, and then you have the main argument. So, what I'm trying to also say is that these are the most important components of an abstract. However, there is no fixed template that you should have the context first or that you should have the main argument first. Write it in a way that is suitable to your style of writing. If you want to set the context first, go ahead. But if you also want to give me the main argument first and then give me the context, that also works. Just keep in mind that you have to include all these important information. Do not leave your abstract without context. Do not leave your abstract without a one line on your method. Do not leave your abstract without indicating what is its value. And do not, of course, leave an abstract without indicating what is the main argument. Okay. And you will now know just by looking at these abstracts that this is not an introduction. This can't serve as an introduction to a research paper. This is a good summing up of the research paper that has been done. Okay. What you have to avoid. Now, you have to avoid repeating anything in your abstract. You also have to avoid long sentences, heavy use of jargon. Abstract writing, writing an abstract and abstract writing do rely a lot on simpler language as opposed to a proper research paper or your dissertation. Okay. Ellipsis. Do not put just three dots as if this is going to be continued. Sure, this is going to be continued in your research paper, but as I said, this is not an introduction. It's a complete whole in itself. So do not use any ellipses. Quoting from your own paper, do not do that. Tell me what you have done, what this paper argues, and how you have done it. But do not quote from your own paper. That is to be done in the paper once you have started your research, you have put down your methodology, your arguments. That is where you leave your own quotes or whatever, but not in the abstract. Overcitations or specific references to other works, figures, tables, images, etc. Basically, overcitation or over specific references to other works. Because again, this abstract would otherwise then become a literature review, which we don't want this to happen. right? So do not do this. Avoid these things. Now, another important thing that you have to remember is not everything that you read or wish to write in your chapter, journal article, or you've written in your chapter or journal article goes into your abstract. Otherwise, there'll be no end to that abstract because you'll keep on writing and writing and writing and writing. Now, to get started on how to formulate your abstract, these are questions and try to answer these in your own in this order. Question one should be the first question, two, three. Okay, so we are following a particular order. And before this, I think Sonali, you would like to maybe intervene. We're not writing right now, right?
No, we'll
Uh,
have the writing session
yeah.
tomorrow.
Yeah, so these are questions for you to consider when we start writing tomorrow. So maybe this is how you can start thinking from today itself. So sit with these questions, think about it, and then formulate it as abstract tomorrow when we have our proper writing session. So the first question, and again, these are not my questions. I have taken these from Alive in the Writing, Drafting, Ethnography in the Company of Chicago. The first thing is sketch the first steps that brought you to your project, mentioning specific people or ideas. Again, this is a useful question, not just to write an abstract, but also to start thinking about research, your own research. Okay, what is it or how did you come to it? So, sketch those first steps. Think about how you came to your project, mention specific people, mention those ideas. Once you have done that, you move on to the next point, which is where you start with the prompt, a turning point, or showdown, or argument, or flashback, anything that I particularly want to tell you about is. And then think about what was the turning point for you. Now, consider the different media beyond written form that you might use to represent the scene you chose. Then return to words and consider the different ways that a scene could be communicated. Begin writing about the same scene from the vantage of a different narrator, from the point of view of a different narrator. And once you have that, through your proposed research, what are the kinds of literatures that you hope to be in conversation with? Make the plan of a room where you try to locate a cluster of 3 to 4 themes that speak to you and that animate your project, a core set of writers and researchers whose work you hope to be engaging with, the kinds of literatures you plan to be delving into as part of your research. By the time you come to this fourth question, you would have a skeleton of an abstract ready, the skeletal draft of an abstract ready. And if you actually think more closely about this, you would remember going through the two examples that of the abstracts that we just went. This is basically what happened, right? So this will also, I mean, these are good questions to get you started. A, if you're still trying to figure out what to research about, and two, how to write an abstract. This is not the definite way to arrive at an abstract, but to start thinking if you're stuck on how to write an abstract. So you should have a skeleton of an abstract ready once you have the answers to these questions. Now, an important thing is your self checkpoint. Describe when you have done this, or if you have your research ready, which could be the case for could be the case for most of you. How then do you condense it into an abstract? Think then of describing a proposed research project in a very brief format to any of the following people: an interlocutor you interviewed as part of your research, an institutional review board, or your future self. Try to distill what your project is about, your preparedness, and your plans for it as succinctly as possible. And this will again lead you to the very specifics that would go into an abstract. Okay. And another important tip is that if an abstract is written after your research is conducted, that is a different thing. But sometimes it so happens that you may write an abstract, and by the time you do your research and write your paper, there is little dialogue between the two. Feel free to edit your abstract accordingly. Okay, so you can always go back to editing your abstract as well, depending on how your research has taken shape. But do ensure that your research paper or your dissertation is in dialogue with the abstract, and that the two are not different components within the same thesis. Okay. So, this is an important point to consider because sometimes we lose sight of what we have written in the abstract and what we end up writing when we start writing a research paper. I'm open to questions now.
Thank you so much, Sonakshi, for such a thorough guiding session. Now the floor is open for the audience. Please feel free to type out your question in the chat box, or you can also raise your hand and unmute and ask question directly to Sonakshi.
Hello, Sonakshi. Thank you for that very, very important and guiding session. I just wanted to know about, I just had this question in my head right from the outset of the session, that when we start writing the abstract before writing the paper, say for instance, we have to send an abstract for writing a paper, but to a journal, but we haven't started writing the paper yet. So, like you mentioned, the main arguments of the paper should be clear right at the outset in the abstract. But since we haven't written the paper yet, so we are not sure what would be the outcomes. That would also, reflect upon kind of how we are imagining to theorize our paper in the get go. So in that case, how do we start the writing process? What do we do in that case if you're not sure what is the probable outcome and how the argument will follow if we haven't started writing the research paper yet?
Okay, thanks for this. I think this is a very important question to consider because I mean, it so happens, and I think I've seen a lot of academic memes also that, you also send out an over-promising abstract and then you realize that, oh no, this is not what my paper is also going to be when the conference is around the corner. So my suggestion is, and I've been there, I have kind of like written abstracts without really like, also reading or knowing what the outcome of the paper would be. So, in these instances, what I would suggest is that start your research early. It's not necessary to have the entire paper written, but identify your central thesis. What is your central argument? And who are the scholars that you are going to look at, or at least one or two scholars who have worked in that particular area or on that book, right, or concept, and then write your abstract based on your own understanding of the concepts. And again, if I were to go back to the initial slides that I shared about research, so I think this is where your research would come in handy, right? So you'll have to like figure out, okay, are these authors speaking to my perspective? So if I have this argument or if this is my thesis, are they for it or are they against it? If they're against it, then you can have something on the lines of, just because you are submitting an abstract and you're still not very sure and you don't have the kind of time to read through the entirety of that corpus, you can just say that my paper will look into the differing, or this paper situates a differing opinion or something like this. Okay, but the point being that research come up with one central argument or thesis statement, and at least two scholars that could be put in dialogue with your research, right? And this could be same opinion or differing opinions. And you could just like take up one of their works or just a general idea of what they have proposed. And through that concept, also kind of situate your research, at least in the abstract. And then what you do in the paper, that is like a different story altogether. But that would indicate to me that, okay, you have used these two scholars or you have used their concept. If using the name of the scholars is a problem or reading their work is a problem, right? So, like when we think about biopolitics, now we use biopolitics quite a lot. And we just closely associate biopolitics with Foucault, right? So you don't have to like go a lot into detail of reading about biopolitics or reading a lot into Foucault, right, when you're writing the abstract. So just mentioning or signposting and ensuring that these concepts and researchers appear later in your abstract, that should do at the go, right? I hope this answers your question. But I still suggest that do your research, right? At least take 3 days to research well and come up with a solid thesis statement. You should know what you're arguing about. That should be on you.
We have a second question in the chat box.
Right.
So Payal is asking, in case of English literature, do we need to briefly mention the storyline of the literary text in the abstract that we are going to critically analyze in the paper?
Okay. I would say no. You don't have to mention the storyline. It is a general assumption that people who are looking at this book or at this abstract or paper already know it. So do not waste the word count on this. What, however, you can mention is definitely a central, say, an incident that is central to your analysis. That could be something which you introduce, but not the entire storyline. So, like for example, in The Vegetarian by Han Kang, you don't need to mention what The Vegetarian is about, but something to my analysis would central to my analysis. Say if I'm doing something about why something about arboreal imaginings in literary novels, and Han Kang is one of like The Vegetarian is one of them. What I would include in my abstract is that Hyongai is becoming a tree, and part three of the novel deals with the protagonist of the novel becoming a tree. Okay, instead of me giving an entire introduction to the novel. So, that one central incident, which is also central to my analysis or to my research, is what I would introduce in my abstract and not the entire storyline. I hope this answers your question.
We still have some time. Are there any other questions? Please feel free to raise your hand
Hello,
or type in the chat box.
hello. Hi, Sonakshi.
Hi.
So some conferences ask for extended abstracts and they write that it should not be more than 800 words or 1000 words. So could you please explain that? How is it different from these abstracts and what do they ask for?
Right. So, in case of extended abstracts, what usually happens is that they also look for your methodology. So for extended abstracts, what I would suggest is that you put forth your central argument and then say in 300 words, that is what your regular abstract might just look like. In the next 300 words, include your methodology, like what is it that you did, and also some include the names of scholars and how your work differs from them more critically. So instead of just like signposting or just like indicating their names, you can go a bit into the depth and actually include them or give away what already exists in terms of research and how your research is going to be an interesting intervention. So that is how I would see an extended abstract working in my favor. Um, uh, uh, Basically including your methodology and also existing literature review. Not to include or incorporate everything, but the central parts of it, which are crucial to your immediate
Oh, okay,
argument. So, yeah.
thank you.
Okay, can we use AI in helping with ideas resources? I would strongly say no, because AI is notorious for hallucinating. So it will come up with names of scholars that don't exist and research papers that don't exist. So do not use AI. Google Scholar, of course, you can just type in a keyword, as I mentioned, and related keyword like related research articles will just show up for you. But stay away from AI. You don't want to end up making up the name of a scholar and submitting your abstract. So stay away from AI. It's not a good resource to brainstorm either. I hope this helps.
If there aren't any more questions, I would just like to give a short announcement about the writing session that we are having tomorrow. So, as I also briefly explained in the introduction, it will not be a guided session, but it will be an open session where we'll expect all of you to come with your own project, whatever you're working on right now. And we are just going to sit together, of course, online and try to implement, of course, whatever we have learned from Sonakshi's presentation today. So we'll have those guiding questions that Sonakshi shared in the presentation, and we'll try to follow those directions and apply those while writing our own ideas and while putting our own ideas into an abstract form. So I have launched a short poll. If you could see that on your screen, where I would just like to get an idea how many of you who are present here would be able to attend tomorrow's writing session. It will start from 11 a.m. IST, and we'll sit together for around 2 hours and write our own material. We'll try to write abstract, of course, and in between we'll have one conversation when we could share the problems that we are facing, or we can also share tips, advices, and just to make the space more inclusive and help each other out in writing our ideas. Yes. So do we have any more questions? Okay, Payal is asking, should we not use AI for brainstorming even?
Sounds very, this might sound very lucrative as an idea that you want to, just open Chat GPT and be like, okay, I want to do this research, give me. I would say no. No. Okay. And again, my rationale is the same, that even if you start brainstorming, it might be hallucinating, or it might also give you ideas while brainstorming, ideas that already exist in terms of published papers. And you might end up plagiarizing something that exists. Okay. So it's better to do your own research. If you want to brainstorm, reach out to your cohort of scholars, right? Reach out to your cohort of or your supervisor and and like brainstorm with them. But do not rely on AI at all for this. Because the loopholes are many. Okay, and it's artificial intelligence for a reason. Do not privilege that to your intelligence. Do not. So that's my advice.
If there are not any more questions, then we can probably conclude this session. Thank you so much once again, Sonakshi, for such a thorough session. I think the examples were really helpful, and your advices on do's and don'ts in while writing abstracts were also